Alright, welcome to Unit 8, Part 2. And in this video, we're going to look at how dictators came to power in Europe and Asia in the first half of the 20th century. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, before we get into how these dictators came to power, let's review real quick why the conditions were ripe for their rise in the first place. Remember from the last video that after World War I, pretty much everyone was tired of democracy. In democratic countries, citizens had seen their elected leaders bumble through one heck of a global pandemic, followed by a devastating war, followed by an economic crisis. And so people began to wonder if maybe democracy wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. And then along came a trio of really bad hombres who promised to save their respective countries from their problems if only the people would let them. And by save their countries, they meant take over their countries and do whatever the heck they wanted with them. Now, we've got three of these jackwagons to look at: Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy, and militarist Japan in Asia. But before we get into the particulars of each of these dictatorships, let's just review real quick the general characteristics of a dictatorship just so we're clear about what we're looking at. In a dictatorship, like with any other form of government, there is a government, which means there are policies that are made and enforced. But unlike a democracy where those policies are made by elected representatives, in a dictatorship, those policies are made by a single individual or a small group of individuals. In order for a dictator to maintain power, he or she or they will typically do three things. 1. Use propaganda to control the flow of information in the country. 2. Use the military and police force to keep the populace in line. And 3. Use terror and violence against anyone who opposes them. And this use of terror and violence is probably the most important characteristic of a dictatorship because it strikes at the very heart of democracy. You see, in a democracy, the government draws its power from the people. If the people don't like the government, they can vote and put new people into office. But if you have a government that uses terror and violence against those who oppose them, then no one is safe from the government, meaning no one can effectively oppose the government. And so the government can continue indefinitely without any real opposition. Alright, now let's start with Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. So in order to understand how Hitler came to power, you need to understand that Germany took the short end of the stick at the Paris Peace Conference following World War I. Not only did they lose the war, but the terms of the Treaty of Versailles were extremely harsh. Remember, Germany had been responsible for starting the war and had caused massive devastation across Europe. And so they were forced to accept full blame for the war and were ordered to pay reparations to the victors. Not to mention being stripped of all of their overseas colonies and having their territory reduced by more than 13%. Also, the victorious Allied powers created a buffer zone between Germany and France by taking control of the region between the two countries called the Rhineland. This was done to prevent future German aggression towards France. And so, in the early 1920s, the German economy was in sharp decline and people were desperate for a way out of their situation. Well, during this time, Adolf Hitler was working as the leader of the Nazi Party. And Hitler, being the charismatic demagogue that he was, began to attract large crowds of angry Germans to his rallies, where he would rant about how the Treaty of Versailles was humiliating for Germany, and that Germany needed a strong leader to revise the treaty and restore German greatness. And so people suffering through the economic depression of the early 1920s flocked to Hitler and the Nazis. Now, while this economic instability was a major factor in Hitler's rise to power, another big one was the failure of the Weimar Republic. Now, remember back in Unit 4 when we talked about how Germany went from a monarchy to a republic in the aftermath of World War I? Well, that transition didn't go super smooth, and the newly established Weimar Republic struggled throughout its existence. It faced significant opposition from both the left and the right. Conservatives opposed the Republic because they missed the good old days of German monarchy, and the Communists opposed it because they wanted a worker-led revolution instead. And so since the Weimar Republic was always fighting to stay alive, it never really gained the support of the people. And that lack of support made it impossible for the Republic to solve the problems that faced the German people. And that, in turn, only led to more people embracing Hitler's message. So with the Nazi Party growing in popularity and the Weimar Republic struggling to survive, it seemed as though Germany might descend into chaos. Well, that's when the leader of Germany's conservative political party, known as the Stahlhelm, stepped in and helped establish a group known as the National Coalition. The National Coalition was basically a cabal of conservatives, industrialists, and military leaders who sought to bring Hitler into the government and use him to crush the communists. They figured that if Hitler could play president, it would be easier to control him than let him run wild outside of the government. But as soon as Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany in January of 1933, he used the power of the presidency to get rid of the checks and balances that the Weimar Republic had put in place. He dissolved the coalition that had appointed him and assumed dictatorial powers. Then he immediately set about crushing his opposition, especially the communists. And the rest, as they say, is history. All right, next up, let's look at Benito Mussolini and fascist Italy. So, the rise of Mussolini in Italy is often compared to the rise of Hitler in Germany because there are a lot of similarities between the two situations. Like Germany after World War I, Italy emerged from World War I not with a sense of triumph, but rather humiliation. You see, before entering the war, Italy had been neutral, but they eventually switched sides and joined the Allies largely because they felt like the Triple Entente hadn't really given them what they wanted out of the war. When the war ended, the victorious powers ignored Italy's contributions to the Allied cause and gave them very little in the way of territorial gains. And so, disillusioned Italians fell into the welcoming arms of the fascist party led by Benito Mussolini. Mussolini, like Hitler, was a charismatic speaker who attracted large crowds of angry Italians, and his message was simple. He blamed the weak and ineffective government in Rome for Italy's problems and promised that if he came to power, he would restore Italian greatness. And so, Italians disillusioned with their government flocked to Mussolini and the fascists. But unlike Germany, there was no significant political party in Italy that Mussolini had to overthrow in order to take power. Instead, he simply gained enough electoral votes to form a coalition government, and then, once he was in power, he eliminated the checks and balances within the government, crushed his opposition, and took control of Italy. All right, now, before we move on to militarist Japan, let me tell you about something I'm really excited about. It's super easy to use. You simply tell them what subject you want to learn about, and they send you these awesomely designed illustrated guides that you can read on your phone or tablet or computer. And I love it, because it allows me to make videos like this one on a subject that some might consider niche. You see, when I started making videos for this channel, I knew I ran the risk of alienating potential viewers who were not interested in everything I had to say. Like, if I make a video about ancient Rome, well, someone watching might be like, oh, Mr. Extraordinaire has made a video about ancient Rome, and I'm not interested in ancient Rome, so I'm gonna click off. But with Nebula, I don't have to worry about that. We can cater to smaller interest groups who are interested in learning about stuff like the Russian Revolution or the Cold War origins or American foreign policy in the Pacific. And if you think this sounds like something you would be interested in, click the link down below to sign up. It's less than $3 a month, and you get access to thousands of hours of amazing documentaries. You also get ad-free versions of my videos as soon as they're uploaded. Plus, you can watch videos like this one without having to worry about pesky ads getting in the way of your learning. Seriously, it's an amazing deal. So check it out and join us. All right, now let's finish up with militarist Japan. So to understand how militarist Japan came to power, you need to understand that Japan had undergone rapid industrialization and modernization in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And as Japan grew economically, they grew increasingly aggressive in their foreign policy. Now, prior to the Meiji Restoration in 1868, Japan had been a small, relatively insignificant island nation. But after undergoing rapid industrialization and modernization, they became a significant player in world affairs. And as Japan grew economically, they developed a desire for raw materials that they didn't have on their island. And so, in order to acquire these resources, they began to expand their empire across Asia. In 1894, Japan went to war with China over control of Korea. And even though Japan didn't win the war, they did manage to force China to recognize Korea as independent from Chinese rule. And that independence wouldn't last long. In 1904, Japan would declare war on Russia in a conflict known as the Russo-Japanese War. Japan defeated Russia and seized control of Korea and parts of Manchuria. And so with their victories against China and Russia, Japan realized that they could become a major player in world affairs. And so Japanese leaders began to advocate for an aggressive foreign policy. They drafted a series of military plans for the conquest of Asia, and they even began to build alliances with other nations that shared their imperial ambitions. In particular, Japan formed a strong alliance with Great Britain, and together they would dominate East Asia. However, after World War I, Japan would begin to chafe under British domination. They felt that Britain was keeping them out of the councils where important decisions were being made regarding the future of Asia. And so, in 1922, Japan would leave the Entente powers and pursue an independent course of action. That course would lead them toward war with China. In 1931, Japan would invade Manchuria and use the incident known as the Mukden Incident as an excuse to fully occupy the region. Soon after, they would puppet the entire country of China. And so, with China effectively conquered, Japan turned westward toward the Dutch East Indies and French Indochina in search of raw materials, and that expansionism would eventually lead them into conflict with the United States. So, we'll stop here. Click here if you need help getting access to all of your documents, and I'll see you in the next video.